Hello and welcome to Take Two, the programme that takes a look at the big issues behind the news. I'm Ian Henshall. Today we're looking at the strategic game in the Pacific as the US moves out of the Middle East and, in the jargon, pivots to Asia. And meanwhile here in London, house prices are soaring and the reasons we find are to do with the global issues. But first we kick off with some news items from around the planet. And we're going to start with the Vatican, a global power centre that has fallen out of favour with the Western establishment in recent years. When the media mention the Catholics at all, it is most likely in connection with child abuse scandals. But they may have missed a bigger story, the radical change of direction announced by the new Pope, Pope Francis. Many Catholics complain that the media focus on Catholic child abuse, rather than, for instance, the Jimmy Savile network at the heart of the UK establishment, is politically motivated. And they seem to have a case. The Church of Rome, even before the new Pope, has long been calling for social justice, explicitly condemning what they call straight-out contemporary capitalism. Not only that, but all the wars, from the bombing of Kosovo in the 90s to Syria now, have met with clear and fierce condemnation from the Catholic Church. But now the new Pope Francis seems to be taking things even further. In a document issued at the end of November, he calls for people to act as, quotes, committed and responsible citizens, not as a mob swayed by the powers that be. He condemns widespread and deeply rooted corruption, quotes, found in many countries, in their governments, businesses and institutions, whatever the political ideology of their leaders. In other words, he's breaking a big taboo there, because only they are corrupt, according to our leaders. The Pope's now gone on to even more dangerous territory with an attack on the mafia's power structure in the Vatican Bank. The last Pope who tried to clean up the Vatican Bank was John Paul I, who died of a heart attack a few months after taking office. Contrary to media reports at the time, his family doctor said that John Paul I did not have a heart condition prior to his untimely death. Now a leading mafia prosecutor in Italy has sounded a similar warning for Pope Francis. Nicola Gratteri has told the Italian daily Il Fatto Quotidiano, quotes, Pope Francis is dismantling the centres of economic power in the Vatican. I don't know if organised criminals are in a position to do something, but they're certainly thinking about it. They could be dangerous. Gratteri does not buy into the US media-created story of the mafia, which holds that they are a bunch of politically irrelevant street mobsters. He says, quotes, the mafia that invests, that launders money, that therefore has the real power, is the mafia which has got rich for years from its connivance with the church. And many, of course, would add connivance with other institutions in the West. The NSA spying scandals continue unabated. Some people are saying that we already knew that the government spies on us. But Edward Snowden and Julian Assange have shown that NATO governments are able to gain access to most, if not all, global communications and plan to keep the information indefinitely. This is no longer a conspiracy theory, it is a fact, supported by the NSA's own documents. Now, the latest leaks have confirmed yet again just how universal the spying is. Led by the US and the UK, Canada and Australia, with other NATO allies as junior partners only. French newspaper Le Monde reports that the content of calls is recorded by French secret police and passed on to the NSA. It appears that the system was used to spy on French government officials and commercial targets too. So why did the French president pretend that his government was the victim rather than the perpetrator of this? Could it be that the, quotes, anger of US allies was partly because their colleagues in the NSA were careless enough to let the secret out? Just a question, but we'll be looking into that. As we mentioned on the previous Take-Two show where we discussed the NSA, one potential application for these Orwellian levels of surveillance would be to amass blackmail material on the second-tier states like France and Germany. It could be that the anger of people like Merkel and Hollande is more to do with embarrassment that their subservient role in the US network has been exposed. Watch this space as things develop. And now finally for the news, we've got a success story from India. Success in India for citizens' income. For a long time now, some economists have suggested a revolutionary way to give everyone some of the share they deserve in the society and economy that we have all helped to create, along with our ancestors, of course. The idea of the citizen's income is to pay everyone a minimum basic sum without means testing, not as a favour, but as a right. It could be paid for by a land tax, effective inheritance taxes, or some other tax on the rich. But would it work? Would the undeserving poor just go off and get drunk if they got something for nothing? Well, an interesting experiment in India suggests that the plan could be successful. Indian charity SEWA, which stands for Self-Employed Women's Association, gave out a small amount of cash regularly to everyone in several villages for about 18 months. Compared to the control villages, which received nothing, after the 18 months was over, the citizens' income villages were showing marked improvements in everything from malnutrition to increased investment in agricultural tools. There was no increase in alcohol consumption, though. The project was supported by Guy Standing, Professor of Economics at London's SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. Citizens' income advocate Clive Menzies, who we have interviewed on RADYV, and you can see it on our archive on the internet, comments, "What was truly surprising was the escalation of economic activity due to people no longer scratching for survival. It wouldn't cost much, why don't we do it? We'll have more on the citizens' income proposal in future bulletins and reports." As we discussed in the last show, the US and Western peace deal with Iran was greeted in Israel and Saudi Arabia with howls of fury and accusations of betrayal. It seems the Obama White House is backing off from military action in the Middle East, but there are clouds on the horizon. With the US now more or less self-sufficient in energy, could this just be a freeing up of US troops to enable the opening of a new confrontation in Asia? I have Roy Hunter in the studio here to cast some light on these issues. So Roy, surely this would be a deeply cynical analysis. Do you really think that they're planning another war or another confrontation, even as everybody's thinking we've made a turn to peace?
Well, Ian, I don't think they really have a choice, to be honest. The Chinese hold about $2 trillion in US Treasury bonds, and they theoretically could bring down the dollar by dumping the dollar on the international markets. The US has lost its economic edge in relation to China, so all it really has is its military, and as the old saying goes, if all you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail.
So how is this pivot to Asia manifesting itself?
In 2012, the Japanese government declared it was buying some of the islands from some private owners, which angered the Chinese. And since then they've been sending Coast Guard ships to the area to counter the Japanese presence, really. In November of this year, the Chinese government announced it was setting up an air defence zone around the islands, and warned other nations that if they were flying through them or sending ships through them, they've asked those vessels to identify themselves and state their destinations. But these conditions seem to have been flouted by the US, Japan and South Korea, and that's further angered the Chinese. And recently the US have flown 2 B-52 bombers through the zone without informing the Chinese. I think the point here is that the details of this dispute are fairly irrelevant, really. The US is decided to pivot to Asia, and this dispute is just the mechanism they've chosen to achieve that aim. I mean, I remember when Iran was asked why they wouldn't back down over the nuclear issue, and the Ayatollah Khomeini replied that, and I paraphrase, that the Americans are coming for us anyway, it might as well be over the nuclear issue. But what, I think one interesting point to understand about this pivot away from the Middle East is that the Americans are almost self-sufficient in energy now.
Yes, and that must make a huge difference, mustn't it? And there's this issue about multiple operations. They at one time they were saying that they wanted to be able to fight 2 wars, didn't they?
Well, I think the phrase was multiple theatres simultaneously they wanted to fight.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting that we see them having to end one conflict before they start another conflict.
Yeah, so we've got 2 very major things. So one is they seem to be dropping the 2 wars at a time doctrine, and 2, they don't need Middle East oil any longer.
They don't need Middle East, and they're almost self-sufficient now. They reckon they'll be self-sufficient by 2017.
Wow!
And most of that's actually due to fracking.
Fracking?
Yeah, it's the fracking.
Lovely.
And in October of this year, Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State during the 1973 oil crisis, he made an interesting statement back in October. He says, "You could not make plans in the Middle East or involving Middle East crises without keeping in mind the considerations of the oil market. But that is now changing substantially with the, I wouldn't say self-sufficiency, but the narrowing gap between supply and demand in North America. That is now of huge strategic consequence." So they don't need Saudi Arabia anymore, really. They don't need the Middle Eastern oil. So, Saudi Arabia is now feeling like a faithful wife who's been cast aside for a younger woman after 40 years.
So that's the old American interests in the Middle East, and now we've got the new interests in Asia, or the new emphasis, the pivot to Asia. So I suppose that's Japan, is it?
It is Japan, and Japan has been talking to the US, and it's been talking to 10 other Asian countries as well, and they're setting up a new National Security Council based on a Western model, really, and Cameron and Haig are going to be advising on that.
This is internally in Japan. They're setting
this
up.
This is internally in Japan, but they're setting up a mutual security pact with the US and these other allies, and they've had a very pacifistic constitution since the war, like Germany had, really. They weren't, and they've been prohibited from using force to settle international disputes up until now. But now they're looking at changing the constitution. Article 9 of their constitution is being changed to strengthen the forces' ability to defend what Japan considers to be its own interests, including territories, allies, and assets.
So we're watching a country change from a pacifist constitution to a NATO type outlook. Yeah, and
the thing is that China's military, economic, and military power now has been growing for many years, as we know, and Japan thinks that their actions are justified in the light of this new military power and economic power from China.
And of course, it's great for votes if you can find a foreign enemy to wave in front of the public.
Well, Abe Shinzo, who's the Prime Minister, was elected a year ago now, December 2012. He's quite right-wing, and there's the usual right-wing agenda coming through. There's laws being passed now that are making it much more difficult for whistleblowers and journalists.
Oh, great.
The same as we see across the rest of the neoliberal world, really.
So Japan's turning into the new Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah.
With the money spent on, except they haven't got any oil, and that must be a problem for them. Their energy their lack of energy must be a problem, especially after Fukushima.
But you've got to see this from the Chinese perspective, really. I mean, they've had a hard time over the centuries with the Western powers.
But particularly Japan.
Well, Japan in 1937 was invaded China, and
massive.
There's a big trauma there for China.
Absolutely.
And the West, we ran the opium wars. We had the Chinese population addicted to opium, which we were growing in India, shipping over to China, selling the opium to the Chinese for tea, taking the tea back to England. That was the triangle. That was the trade triangle. So the Japanese invaded them in 1937. They're scared of that. We forced them. They tried to stop us importing the opium, and we basically
had a war.
We basically bombed them into submission to accepting our opium.
Yeah, it's all true. I know you couldn't make it up, could you?
So you can understand that the Chinese dragons are a little bit nervous, really, of this new conflict that's coming their way with two of their major old enemies.
Yeah, thanks very much, Roy.
Okay, thank you.
Now we're going to look at a huge underreported story that's both local and global. The housing crisis in London. This is not about house prices. You have to be a millionaire to afford an actual house in most parts of London. This is just about somewhere, anywhere to live. Prices were expensive before the crash, the 2008 crash that is, and never really fell after it, propped up by near zero interest rates. The average London property now costs around £250,000, according to the Halifax Bank. Deposits on mortgages are beyond the reach of those on average earnings. London's housing shortfall is increasing by more than 20,000 homes per year. With wealthy overseas buyers increasingly buying London properties, Liberal Democrat MP Simon Hughes said recently that London is becoming an enclave of the world's super rich. Our correspondent Fran Anderson finds out why.
In London, there's an influx of wealthy overseas buyers, whilst many Londoners find that properties are just too expensive, whether they're renting or buying. And soaring rents and benefit caps are forcing people on low incomes to move out of London, whether they're in or out of work. And many wage packets just cannot cover living costs anymore. And without excess income, people can't buy consumer goods, which negatively affects the economy.
Can you tell us more about the super rich buying up London?
Unrestricted amounts of foreign money are pouring into London's housing market. The Bank of England says it's 23 billion a year since 2010. And huge swathes of London have been bought up at an alarming rate. It's wealthy people from unstable countries in the Middle East and from China, Russia, and also from the crisis-prone Eurozone countries. Snapped up are districts in London such as Chelsea, Kensington, Mayfair, and Central London, including residential and commercial properties and even whole shopping centres. Some are dubbing London as the top playground for oligarchs, dictators and the super rich, who find it easy to hide their money here. According to Savills estate agents, only 2/3 of London property buyers intend to live or work in London, resulting in hundreds of unoccupied properties. It's clear the rich are buying London properties as an investment for their money.
So what's happening on the in the scene for ordinary Londoners? Hasn't the government got a help to buy scheme or something like that? Isn't that going to make it worse?
Well, Savills estate agents report that the influx of the world's rich has encouraged development of properties costing more than £2 million to buy or £5,000 a month to rent, whilst neglecting to build affordable homes for ordinary Londoners. This is disastrous, as more than 50% of housing demand is from households earning less than £50,000 a year.
Yeah.
Savills also warned that businesses could be forced out of London because their workforce cannot afford accommodation. With the Help to Buy scheme, dubbed by Geraint Davis MP, the Help to Sell or the Help to Vote for the Tories, there's help with deposits with interest-free loans for the first 3 years for buyers who can only afford 5% of a deposit on a property valued up to £600,000. So that's quite a lot of money we're talking. But this could put future government finances at risk, as temporary cheap debt could turn into expensive debt for the home buyers, once interest rates rise, say, above 6%. This could lead to mortgage defaults, and it could cause problems for banks, obviously, and also for the economy.
Well, the Bank of England's been in their polite and very tactful way. They've been saying that they're worried about it fueling a housing bubble. In other words, the government's mad. I mean, that I think it's fair to say that when they use language like that from the Bank of England, they're really worried. And who isn't?
Well, practically everybody seems to be sounding alarm bells. Economists and bankers and everybody. Also, the Help to Buy scheme pushes house prices up in general, as there's a scarcity of new homes. As the Labour Party spokesman Chris Leslie said, rising demand for housing must be matched with rising supply. But under this government, house building is at its lowest level since the 1920s.
Is there any oversight of this Help to Buy scheme?
Interesting question. The Bank of England's Governor Mark Carney claims the final say to say scrap it or amend it would rest with the government, whilst the government housing minister claims that it's the Bank of England's responsibility. But who is right? I mean, surely it's the government's responsibility, as it was created by them. Is the government nervous and seeking to shift the blame onto the Bank of England should things go wrong? I mean, it certainly looks that way.
Well, it's certainly pretty odd that nobody even knows who's in charge of this. So the Help to Buy, it could cause another crash like we saw in 2008. Why is the government doing this?
Well, who knows? It seems to be some short-term financial fix by the government. As the bubble may burst after the next election, it will be the next government that will have to clear up the mess.
What could the UK do to address London's housing needs?
Well, there could be a few things they could do, Ian. They could restrict foreign purchasing of UK land and homes.
Yes.
Many countries in the world restrict this to those who pay UK taxes and are resident in the UK. A second thing, they could address the gap between property prices, rent prices on the one hand, and the wages and benefits, which are decreasing. Instead of a minimum wage, they could replace it with the living wage and stop any more benefit cuts. And the third thing they could do is have a help to build scheme. Give tax incentives to developers to release more land specifically for affordable homes, whether for buying or for social housing. And they could make the corporations and the rich pay their taxes to help fund more social house building. And I spoke to an ex-Ministry of Defence employee who just wants to call themselves A. Cooper Dixon, and he says, in quotes, the damage that the government is allowing to happen to the UK is as bad as the Nazis. This is UK state-sanctioned economic terrorism, and the Tories are traitors to this country. Where's the British Army when you need them?
Well, we've come to a pretty bad state if we need the army to save us from the Tories.
Yes.
I mean, one can think of other things as well. For instance, a tax on empty houses, seeing as you're not allowed to squat in them any longer.
Important to make the point quite firm that this is an unprecedented amount of London properties being bought up by the overseas rich people.
Yeah.
It's unprecedented, and it's going to damage the economy of London.
Yeah, it's only good news for the rich. I'm often amused when, some people on the mainstream media, they sort of look happy when they talk about rising house prices. Well, you're not happy about rising house prices unless you've already got a nice big house. Everybody else should be sad about rising house prices, although they might feel they're getting richer. There's no point if you've got to live in your house, then it doesn't really matter how much it costs. The less the better, really. And
the most expensive street in London, in fact, in the world, is Kensington Palace Gardens W8, where the average house price is £19.2 million.
Wow, the most expensive street in the world is in London. Great.
The contrast to what's going on with all the super rich buying up all these properties is ordinary Londoners. More and more of them are having to turn to food banks to eke out their pay packet, or their benefits just aren't covering their living costs anymore, and it's appalling that there's so many of them turning to food banks. They're mushrooming all over the country, and London in particular.
Extraordinary.
And I read in the paper the other day that Southwark Council sold a council property for £1 million. What are they doing that for? They've got lots of people on their waiting list to, needing a house, and there they are selling a council house for £1 million. They could have housed somebody in that. We don't need to have a house shortage. It's quite clear. If developers were encouraged with tax incentives or whatever, they could so easily build houses that were affordable.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Fran. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of Take Two, produced by RADYV for the People's Voice. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back next week.